Former President Trump announced yesterday that he's suing Twitter, Facebook, and Google and their respective CEOs over alleged censorship. The lawsuit comes after the tech companies removed him from their platforms following the January 6th attack on the Capitol. Here's the news straight from Donald Trump himself.
We're demanding an end to the shadow banning, a stop to the silencing, and a stop to the blacklisting, banishing, and canceling that you know so well. Our case will prove this censorship is unlawful, it's unconstitutional, and it's completely un-American.
Democratic strategist, the maestro Roger Fisk, and senior policy analyst at the Independent Women's Forum, Inez Stepman, join us to discuss. Roger, here's kind of an uncomfortable question. If the left believes that these social media companies are effectively public utilities and ought to be regulated like public utilities, at what point then do you have to say that everyone in the public has to have access to them?
Mm-hmm. Well, first off, good morning, Ryan and Emily, and thank you for having me on with Inez. That is jumping ahead to, I thought, what was going to be our second segment, which is more of the antitrust kind of dimension of this. To focus specifically first on the president, it's stunning to me. I'll set aside, his character deficiencies because those are so easy. How he can have this bottomless appetite for self-pity and still be regarded as a strong leader by some people says something about human psychology that I can't decipher. But what's very interesting to me is a couple of years ago with the Colorado baker, the GOP was insisting that, private business owners had the right to decline services if they wanted. And now, under the auspices of the America First movement, they can force that baker to provide that cake, which in this context is obviously tech companies and forcing them to provide a platform to people. And then the last thing would be, I'm still stunned that, obviously this is a fundraising ploy. I think yesterday was the first time that I had seen him use the phrase America First Policy Institute or whatever that is. And obviously this is kind of a fundraising ploy for that. So to couple this kind of, this another chapter in his kind of, temper tantrum that's been going on for 6 years, and link it with the broader discussion about whether or not the tech companies are public utilities. I think we need to deal with the news of yesterday before we get to the broader conversation of the tech companies and their responsibilities to people. But that's an extremely interesting conversation to have, and it's one worth having as well.
So, I disagree because I think they're necessarily intertwined. And I think, Roger, you would say the same thing. But I think you have a hard time talking about the Trump point without talking about the antitrust issues because, Roger, you referenced Jack Phillips, who is the Colorado baker that Republicans and people on the right, and I know Inez is going to have a lot of thoughts on this, used to say, well, just bake the cake. That's the sort of command from the left is just bake the cake. And then it's been flipped around to conservatives saying, well, just allow the speech to these private companies. But the point, that's exactly the point, and it gets to what Ryan is saying, is that there's now these lawsuits, and as I'm curious for your take on this, the way that I'm reading this and what I think the media is missing is that what Trump is ultimately challenging with these lawsuits is the structure of tech companies, the legal structure of tech companies themselves. I think there is an actual increasing recognition on both the left and the right that maybe these are to be nationalized and treated as public utilities, and that's why lawsuits like this are filed. It's so that you can have that conversation about what these platforms actually are. What do you make of that, Inez? I think we can probably all agree these things are symbolic, that I don't think Trump thinks he's going to win and this is going to become a First Amendment issue. But isn't the fact that he's talking about this as a First Amendment issue getting to that point about how they're really challenging the structure of the companies?
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head in the sense that this lawsuit is based on an entirely different set of cases than the Jack Baker lawsuit. And the difference here is that they're alleging that these very large companies are actually essentially doing the bidding of government agencies. So they're alleging that there's collusion between the government and large private companies that essentially is allowing the government to go beyond the Constitution in terms of what it can do, in this case, in terms of censoring people, or in terms of not allowing them to speak. They're arguing that that agencies in the government are telling Facebook and Twitter who to kick off their platforms, so that collusion effectively makes them state actors. Now, it's a novel legal argument. I do think it's one that we need to explore. I don't know how courts are going to look at it. There isn't a lot of precedent. There's definitely a thin case to file. I do think that this is how we're going to be talking and looking at this issue in the future. And the other aspect that's interesting of this lawsuit is they are alleging that Section 230 that gives protections to large tech companies, to social media companies from being sued based on what's on their platform. They're alleging that entire statute is unconstitutional. And they're really relying here on Justice Thomas's dissent, where he raises the question of whether or not these large companies should be considered common carriers. But none of these issues are actually overlapping with the Baker case. I know that they superficially sound similar. It's about asking private companies who they can and cannot serve. But actually, the issues being raised here are issues of liability for a large company and specifically for publishers that don't exist in the Baker case. And then second, they're really alleging that because these corporations are acting as a cat's paw for government. Now, I don't know if they're going to be able to prove that, but that's what they're alleging in this complaint. They're alleging that these large tech companies are acting essentially on orders of the government, but they're acting as private actors and allowing the government to circumvent the First Amendment and the Constitution. So I think these are really interesting legal arguments. I do agree with Roger on one thing. I do think that the primary purpose for this lawsuit is to put Trump back in the spotlight and to raise money. Right. And that's always kind of been, to my mind, one of the problems I've had with Trump is because he raises these really important issues that the establishment of both parties ignore for way too long. In this case, the collusion between large corporations and government, particularly in the tech space. But he does it in such a way that's easy to dismiss for a lot of people because he always puts himself in the center, and I think he is doing that here. But I think the legal issues are well worth raising, and I think we'll see them brought up again, whether or not this lawsuit comes to fruition. And
the irony here is that if Trump succeeded in removing immunity from these tech companies, he would actually incentivize them to continue the ban. Yeah. Because they're most likely to get sued over people like Trump saying like completely inflammatory things. During the 2016 campaign, if you remember, he said, we need to loosen libel laws. It's too hard to sue people for defamation. And then at his next rally, he said, you know what, I've backed off of that because my advisors pointed out to me that it would be easier to sue me if we loosened up the libel laws. So never mind, I'm backing off of that. And Inez, I'm glad you talked about the difference between the Cake case and this one, because with the argument that the Baker was making was the same argument that people who ran segregated lunch counters made in the 1950s and 1960s, that they have the freedom to serve whoever they want. And the civil rights protesters were saying, no, you don't. We have the freedom to any public accommodation. Any business that is open to the public needs to also be open to all of the public. You can't discriminate based on race or these other categories.
Or these other categories, right, and that's where it gets contentious.
Right, one of the categories, one of the categories though, it would be, say, no shirt, no shoes, no service. Like that's kind of an acceptable policy. But what that's doing is that's discriminating along behavior. And so you could say, okay, Trump's not being discriminated against because he's an old white man. He's being discriminated against because of his behavior. He's basically a guy with no shirt and no shoes. And they're like, we don't want that on our platform. But so 36 states and DC are also suing Google, alleging the company's control over its Android app store violates antitrust laws by squashing potential competitors, limiting app choices, and then jacking up the prices on consumers. Attorney General of New York, Tish James, said, quote, once again, we are seeing Google use its dominance to illegally quash competition and profit the tune of billions. Roger, do you see a way that these conversations are intersecting?
Probably in situations like this, because they're somewhat overlapped. Very quickly, I want to touch on one thing that Inez said. No one's stopping anyone from speaking. What's happening is people are being denied a platform upon which they can amplify. And second, if you're in the wedding business and you don't want a piece of the gay wedding business, then you're probably not going to last all that long. So there's that. It's an interesting thing as startups scale. Because when you're a startup and you're 15, 20, 100, 500 people or whatever, and you're hustling and you're trying to provide more value and you're trying to elbow out competitors, then you're just being aggressive, and then you're just being nimble and you're being agile, et cetera. And then all of a sudden, when you have 250,000 employees and you're doing the same thing, you've bought up all the billboards on the highway and you're pointing everyone to Wall Drug or south of the border or whatever, to use an example from 20 or 30 years ago, pre-internet, if you will. Then all of a sudden it becomes a different conversation about, well, you're elbowing out all these people and you're being aggressive and you're trying to squash your competition. And so the real question to me is, yes, about the framework of the law and stuff, but where in that cycle does it cross from being that aggressive, nimble startup that's trying to elbow competition out of the way and then becoming something that is actually stifling other people's ability to compete? And I don't know that we have an answer with that. I was going back and reading about kind of the Explorer and the Netscape situation, which is somewhat analogous to this. And one could say, there's some schools of thought that say we came to that a couple years late, and there's some people that say we jumped in a little too early in terms of the government getting into the antitrust conversation there. This is a situation also, and I'll end here, where the law and the application of the law is usually about 20 years behind technology. So we're just now kind of getting our arms around, developments of the last 15 or 20 years. And part of it is that, there's an inability, I think, there's a fundamental DNA disconnect between big tech and really a high growth, high change, rapid evolution technology and government's ability to really make sense of it and try to keep up and have laws and regulations that are relevant to it. And that's where I think we find ourselves in that situation.
Well, let's end with you, Inez, because that's all very interesting points. The law being behind technology, and substantially so by about 2 decades, I think is completely accurate. So in the context of this suit, does Letitia James have a point here? Is there a case to be made, and maybe even a bipartisan one, in this instance? Whereas we talk about the Trump case as sort of a symbolic one, is there more substance to this antitrust complaint?
Look, people have been looking at antitrust, ways to get Google with antitrust for a while. Our antitrust law is to some extent not prepared, to Roger's point, to deal with a company like Google that largely doesn't charge its customers, right? So U.S. antitrust law is based on consumer harm. It's very, very difficult to prove consumer harm if the harm is intangible, right? If the harm is not about dollars and cents to the consumer. So that I agree with Roger that our law has not adapted to companies who are essentially selling information as a product, right? Who are selling digital information as a product, and where the point of the consumer, we're not paying to use these services, right? But they're using our data to very great effect to make billions of dollars. So I agree that the law has not caught up there. I think another one of the huge differences between some of these lawsuits against Google, against Twitter, against Facebook, and these large corporations, and the lawsuits that are against small businesses. When you're talking about abridging people's association rights, and that's what we're talking about in either one of these cases, right? We're talking about the right of Twitter to disassociate itself from Donald Trump, or we're talking about the right of Jack Baker to disassociate himself from a behavior, right? Because he did serve gay customers. He just didn't want to prepare a cake for a gay wedding. So that's behavior, not identity. But in any case, you are talking about this kind of refusal of service. I would note that the Civil Rights Act, when it forbade the piece on public accommodations part of the Civil Rights Act, when it forbade people from discriminating on the basis of race, even in the private capacity, it was heavily reliant. The fact that Congress had that power at all, and the fact that it was upheld in the courts, had a lot to do with the fact that there was a lot of this collusion. They didn't use the word collusion, they used right to travel, right? This is the line of cases starting with Hardin of Atlanta. But their point wasn't just that there is one barbecue joint that doesn't serve Black Americans. It's that every barbecue joint in a given geographical area, every hotel, right? Essentially, even though they weren't talking to each other, they were colluding to keep out a certain class of customer. I actually think that doesn't look at all the case in the Jack Baker case, right? In the sense that every other cake shop was happy to serve these customers. Right. But it does look a little bit more like the case in social media, where you have Donald Trump banned from every major social media platform. Now, I guess he started his own, and we can have that, build your own internet conversation. But I do think that there's more similarity there actually in this particular sense, where we're talking about essentially in this case and in the case of segregation, cultural collusion that is not, it's not like everybody in these companies sat down and decided, oh, we're all going to ban Donald Trump, but they hold similar cultural values, and therefore they all found Donald Trump a good candidate to kick off their platforms. So these are novel legal issues. I do think that our legal system is going to have to adjust to take into account some of these issues in some way, but what that looks like, I don't think we know yet.
Inez, you are welcome for our opportunity for you to use your fancy law degree.
Thank you guys for joining us.
Thank you both so much. Coming up, Katie Halpert discusses updates in the Julian Assange case when Rising returns.